Greeting to all Africans on the continent and across the entire world. This is King H, the radical Pan-African actress from Ambazonia, aka Ambas Bay. There's a lot that is going on in the world, and there's a lot that we need to pay attention to through Pan-Africanism. And Pan-Africanism is political, it's spiritual, it's philosophical, and it's economical. It affects global African people all over the world. If you look at African people on the earth, we are affected economically, especially in this hard time. And our political arenas are not strong enough to sustain the growth of African people globally. So we need to look at what is happening around us, because what is happening around us affects us. The US is concerned about Chinese support to Russia. The China-Russia ties has a no-limit friendship. But Africans, do you understand why Western nations are ruling the world? It's because of their no-limit friendship that is sustaining their growth. If you look at Western nations, the G7 nations, which you have United States, United Kingdom, you got Germany, I believe. All those, they work together. Even when they disagree, they work together for their own common growth. And Africans need to learn that if Africans want to survive in this world. African nations and African people around the world need to work together, because Western nations have been doing that for the past 500 years. Even though they fight each other, they always find a way to work with each other in order to survive and thrive. So the Chinese know that. Russians know that. Iran knows that. North Korea knows that. And these nations are finding a connection, a bond, a so-called no-limit friendship in doing business. And they have to if they want to survive. But the United States and the rest of G7 and with the European Union are concerned about the relationship, about the no-limit friendship between Russia and China. It should be. Because the relationship between Russia and China is also connected with the relationship with Iran and North Korea. Is also connected with Venezuela and other nations that have been sanctioned by Western nations. This gives a concern to the Western nations because it affects their money. It affects their resources, affects how they will sustain their wealth, their financial wealth. But their sanctioning affects Russia, affects China, affects the entire world. Look at Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe has been sanctioned by Western nations for so long. And the only way Zimbabwe is surviving is because Zimbabwe has a relationship with China and even a relationship with Russia. But that's what the Western nation do. They sanction nation, they cripple nation. They make nation bend to their will, because in this world, it's a Western world. It's not a world for every other race. It's a Western-dominated world, and you have to either get along with the Western nation or suffer the wrath. So it is beneficial for China, since China has the interest of making Taiwan fall in place with the rules and regulation of China, since Taiwan is part of the one China rule. Taiwan needs to fall in place. And if China wants that to happen without actually fighting a war, it's a very simple thing that China has to do. Think and act boldly. And how can they do that? China is already being sanctioned by the United States and other Western nations, other G7 nations and European Union. And they will continue to face more sanctions, which means that China needs to make an action. The fact that they have a no-limit friendship with Russia is a good thing for China, but a bad thing for Western nations, which is why Western nations are sending serious messages across China not to support Russia militarily. But it is for China's best interests, if China wants to take over Taiwan without fighting, to support Russia. Because there is a too strong negative force that is going against each other, which is G7 and Western nations against China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and their own group. And if China wants to survive, or at least have a fighting chance, then the relationship between China and Russia is going to be put to test. And what China does will affect China and Russia, and also affect the G7 and United States. And that affects the entire world as it is. If you notice, the United States won against South Africa not to allow military ships to get into South Africa, because China, Russia, and South Africa, which are part of the BRICS, are holding a military sponsorship or showmanship. And US won against that. The ambassador, the US ambassador in South Africa, wants against that. But South Africa took a bold step and said, no, Russia is our partner, China is our partner, and we will allow the ships to be in South Africa. This is exactly what China needs to do with the relationship of Russia. China needs to support, since Western nations are against China supporting Russia militarily, then China needs to support Russia militarily. Because the relationship between China and US is going sour, and it's only going to get sour. And China needs to find other ways to do business with nations that they find common interest with, because China no longer have a common interest with United States and Western nations. Then, just like Iran president visited China, China's president needs to visit Russia, talk the business, because you have decided, a certain group have decided to put a certain rules and regulation that needs to be followed, because they see themselves as the gods of the world that control the geopolitics of the world. But that is not so. That should not be allowed in this world. Africa needs to have a voice in this world, because we are part of this world. China needs to have a voice in this world, because China is part of this world. United States and Western nations have a voice in this world, because they're part of this world. But the fact is, Western nations have taken upon themselves to see that they are the one to speak and do for the world, and the world needs to follow. China needs to change that. Russia needs to change that. Africa also needs to change that by making moves, not sitting idle, by making acted moves, bold moves for the interests of Africa and the interests of African people globally. So the United States and the Western nations are concerned about the relationship with Russia and China, because that relationship is going to change the entire geopolitics of the world. What will China do? We don't know. We're yet to see. But Africa needs to understand geopolitics as it is happening and discuss geopolitics, and not to be afraid of politics, even if it leads to our death. Africans should not be afraid of politics, because if you look at the history of Africa, many African leaders have been assassinated by Western nations for the interests of Western nations. From the United States, Black Americans have been assassinated, like Malcolm X, Martin Luther King Jr. In Africa, you have one of the former presidents of Congo assassinated, many others assassinated, because Western nations want to control the entire geopolitics. But if Latin America wants to have a voice in the world, they have to speak up. If Africa wants to have a voice in the world, they have to speak up and do. If China and Russia wants to have a voice in the world, they have to speak up and do not allow G7 and Western nations to control the entire geopolitics of the world. Something must be done. How is it going to be done? I have no idea. We just have to wait and see how this falls through. The war, my personal perspective, the war between Ukraine and Russia. Russia must win this war by every means possible. That's what I want as an African. That's what I want as a Pan-African. Russia must win this war. And if China wants to have a leverage over Taiwan, China needs to support Russia in order for Russia to win this war. Because if Russia wins this war, China will not have to fight Taiwan militarily. The people of Taiwan will bow down respectfully because they don't want to have a war with China. This is King Angel. I'm out.